Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Lee Towns joining me today. And folks, we have a Faith Forward first. And it's not the fact that Lee is joining me. And we're laughing extra because this is take 2 of this because one of the cameras wasn't running. So Lee's been here before. I've been congested before. So that's not the first. The first is Lee did this message on Sunday, and rather than recording it a couple of days prior, we're actually recording it on Monday after. So for the first time ever,
there's no guessing.
There's no guessing. We know what was said.
The record has been set.
The challenge now is we have no excuse for, I'm not sure if I'm going to say this. So we can actually now go back and test.
Exactly.
I said this yesterday. Let's go to the videotape.
That's right. If you throw the red flag for the replay, we'll know.
We're going to have some fun with this one. So if you're just joining us, we're having a good time already. If you've been with us for a while, we're in the 3rd week of this series on off-brand Jesus, or just the idea of off-brand in general. And as consumers, we all know the idea of off-brand. We go into a store, we buy a product that is similar to the original, but it costs us a little bit less for close to, hopefully, the same quality.
Right.
And that's great for us as consumers. It works out well for our pocketbook. But it works out very, very poorly in the life of a believer because there is no acceptable substitute. There is no acceptable off-brand for Jesus, no matter what my T-shirt on Sunday has been saying. And if you don't get that joke, you need to go back to weeks 1 and 2. Lee spared me this week. Thank you for that, sir.
I felt like you'd been on the spot for a few weeks. You needed a break.
I appreciate that. But we've been grounding all of this in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. The idea of having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. That there truly is nothing other than Jesus that offers what Jesus does, though we have tried and we have often succumbed to the temptation that others have promoted of this is really, really close, or in fact, it's the same as, and it's just not. And so 2 weeks ago, Brian sort of fleshed out the general premise of where we were going. Mm-hmm. And last week we talked about one of the temptations of the off-brand life is when we slide from judging correctly, discerning what is true and what is not, what is good and what is not, into judgmentalism, which is the off-brand that I get to sit in the seat of the judge and determine worth and value of others and myself and things like that. And so this week, Lee, you talked about the off-brand of narcissism, because we're trying to use isms because it's a church series and you got to make it cute. So we're not actually going to talk about narcissism today, but we are essentially going to talk about selfishness, and that our selfishness creates a very tempting off-brand version of the life that Jesus died to give us. So usually this is where I say, tell us what you think you're going to say on Sunday. But Lee, give us sort of the 3-minute synopsis of what you think you remember saying yesterday.
Well, the good news is in 3 minutes, I probably can be pretty accurate about what I said. It's when we get past 3 minutes.
That's right.
So when we look back at that 2 Timothy passage, chapter 3, that John referenced, Brian's been referencing, that phrase actually comes at the end of a list, that having the form of godliness but denying its power. Paul has instructed his young pastor friend Timothy about how to lead the people that he is in charge of leading, and some things to watch out for. And when you come to that statement that you should be aware or avoid people who have a form of godliness but deny its power, it tags back to his opening statement that in the last days, difficult times are going to come. And Brian has built out when he talks about in the last days, he's not talking about, hey, Timothy, I want to tell you what it's going to be like in 2024 when you lead a church. He's saying, look, here's the reality. The people you're leading right now are going to reflect some terrible kind of ideologies. Yeah. And he makes a list between that, in the last days, terrible times are going to come, having a form of godliness, but denying the power of. He makes a list. It's not necessarily the comprehensive list of the isms, although you can find the isms that we're going to talk about in many of those qualities. But we started with the first in the list, or what I talked about yesterday was first in the list, lovers of self. And that idea of self-focus, self-indulgence, self-centeredness, all of those kinds of things that would fall in a description of selfishness. And then what happens is he makes that list, and at the very end of the list, just before he says they have a form of godliness, so they kind of look like the real thing, but they're not quite the real thing. Just before he says that, he says, rather than lovers of God. That there's this passion that we create in our life, this alternative kind of ideology, theology that we create in our life that, in one instance creates a self-focus, a lover of self, but it's an alternative to actually being a lover of God. Rather than loving God, we love ourselves. And so yesterday, what I endeavored to do in the conversation or in the teaching and preaching was to take us back to what was the original recipe that God gave us. Yeah. And the original recipe ran along these lines, that God is the creator and we are the created, and we can't get those mixed up. And our life is found when we keep that order right and we exalt God to the creator and we keep our position as the created. The tendency and the temptation that has crept in, and it is a powerful tendency and a powerful temptation and a pervasive tendency and temptation, is to actually move God out of that seat, or at least move him over in that seat of creator, and put ourselves there, and to elevate ourselves to, at best, collaborators with God, but in his worst illustration, we are God and God serves us. And I put it all under kind of a word that I used, meology. So if theology is the study of God or the belief in God and the practice of those beliefs, meology is the study of me and the practice of me-centered thinking. So that's in a simple summary what I did say. Yeah, and I'll stand by that. You can roll the tape.
We can throw the flag on that, and the challenge on the field will be upheld. Absolutely. And so, as is always the case when we get to this Faith Forward platform, the goal is, how do we now take what we heard on Sunday and not just understand it, not just intellectually assent to the truth, because it is true, but how does it then transform the way that we live, and how does it help us to not enact more of the life that Jesus died for us to live out of our own strength and understanding, but to surrender, to correctly reorder the power structure of our life to receive more of the life that Jesus has for us. And so it really does require, and we were just talking before we hit record the first time, that this idea of selfishness is so multifaceted, it's so multi-rooted, that this could be really the heart of an entire series, a year's worth, a lifetime's worth. And so we're not going to be able to land the plane on this topic today, but we're going to hopefully take some helpful next steps. And I love that you pointed out on Sunday, Lee, that, using 21st century language, because in some things we just really love to hyperbolize, that what we're struggling with here are narcissistic tendencies. Very, very few people are actually narcissists, but what we're really dealing with is the obsessive self-focus. And so while very few of us are clinically diagnosable as narcissists, all of us have a significant struggle in the area of, when push comes to shove, I want it my way. I want to dictate terms of how my life is going to go. And that includes, even though I would never say it out loud, though sometimes I do, that includes dictating terms to the God of the universe. And so here's what I was struck by. So we were at church yesterday, listened to you second service. I have no idea how first service went, so I'm only going to hold you accountable for what I heard second service.
Well, the tape's there for the
tape's
service.
There. But so then went home. I'd been feeling sick the last few days. And thankfully, it seemed like my wife, Brooke, had been dodging the bulk of this so far. But as we were getting ready for bed last night, she said, I think I'm starting to feel some irritation in the back, in the throat. And we're like, oh, man, because she had some things coming up this week that she's really excited about. We're like, well, let's pray. And not just like, let's throw up a prayer and hope that it works, because we've seen a lot of God's response to prayers for physical healing in the lives of so many people. And so there's already a level of confidence of, we're going to pray. But I started to pray for my wife, and I was suddenly struck by, oh my gosh, I'm telling God what I want God to do right now. Dang it, Lee. existential crisis. Am I supposed to be praying for healing or not right now? But it was a great moment of reflection that so often goes unreflected, that even in the praying for good things and things that we know in general are in alignment with God's character and God's nature and God's revealed word to all people for all time, we can still find ourselves living out a selfish relationship with God of, all right, God, here's the good things that I know you've been okay with in the past, so can you start doing some of these good things right now, please?
Yeah, and if we're not careful, there's this fine line, and I guess the word I'll use, there's a fine line between asking God for, hey, this is what I would like, would it please you for me to have that, and demanding of God, hey, go do this for me. And you know, it's like anything, like in an authority structure that we live in, like whether it's with our parents or, you know, working with our spouses, and that's a bad, you know, it's bad to use authority structure as it relates to a marriage relationship. But you know, in any relationship we have, there is the prerogative to say, hey, this is what I'd like. It's like, it's like if my family says, what do you want for dinner? Where would you like to go out to eat? We're going to go to a restaurant. Everybody gets to weigh in and say, this is what I would like. The danger is that we say God has to do this. And God's obligated to this. And there's just a fine line, but there's something valuable about a sensitivity to it. A similar story. I was talking about this with my kids. I have 2 grown daughters, and I was talking about this with my kids some time ago. This idea of how we create God in our own image. And I was saying, watch the worship music. And I love worship music. I love the modern worship music. I think it's awesome. It's good for my soul. I sing them regularly. But I just had said to them, hey, notice how many times we say me and I in worship. You know? And because if you contrast the hymns with the modern language, there's far more of the personal pronoun, first person pronoun in there. And I remember my youngest, who is a little more heart wired. My oldest is a little more reason, logic wired. And my youngest came and said, you've ruined all music for me, because everything says that. And that wasn't my intention, and we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But there is a reality that at times we misinterpret and misrepresent the God of the universe because we define him through the lens of our own desires, our own pleasures, and our own wants, and the satisfaction of those things.
Yeah, and I love that thing about the music, because we do have to develop a sensitivity. Right. The idea is to avoid the extremes, as is so often the case. And you know, for those that have listened for quite a while, I've talked pretty regularly here about the waiting that my wife and I have had to do to become parents. And it's been a decade plus long wait. And so over time, I've gone to worship as a way of reassuring and connecting with God. And what I realized was, at one point, I needed to create 2 separate playlists, because there was one that was, and it's called My Hope playlist. And it's so many worship songs that are reminders of God's faithfulness in particular areas to particular people to fulfill particular promises. But what I realized after a while was, so much of I would go to worship and my worship focus was me. My worship focus was, God will do what I want God to do, and God will do what God has promised to me. And so I had to create, this was years ago, I had to create a thankfulness playlist, a praise playlist. And I had to sift out a whole bunch of songs that I really like, because I started to recognize the focus of that song is what God is doing for me, rather than I want to adore and worship God.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that, you know, there's a whole bunch of backstory to this that is not relevant to this. But one of the things linguistically that I have become sensitized to is God keeps his promises. I want to say that.
Like, absolutely.
Right out of the gates, if you're listening to this and you think that in some way, shape, or form, I'm suggesting that God is not faithful to keep his promises. He does. But God's keeping his promises is not because we have held him to what he said. It's because he blesses us, and it's that word blessing. And I have come to appreciate that little word, because it is it gives me the ability to say, God, you've made a promise,
Yep.
and I'm going to live confidently that
Yes.
you're going to be faithful to that promise. I may not fully understand the nuance of that promise, and so I'm going to trust you,
Yeah.
even when it doesn't quite feel like you've kept that promise. I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to live in the blessing that you, the creator of the universe, the lover of me, and the lover of you, the lover of us individually and collectively, that you're going to be faithful to do what you said you were going to do.
Yeah.
And that is a blessing to me.
Yeah.
And I can receive your faithfulness to that promise as a blessing, not as a fidelity to a contract.
Right.
And that shift is huge.
It is. And so again, the goal is always, how do I begin to expose the issue in my life? And then how do I begin to live differently, to think differently, to relate to God differently as a result? Yeah. And so as I was thinking about this last week in preparation for when I thought we were recording, there were two general categories that often seem to come to mind when we get to this practical part. And it's the reality of the deception that comes into our life because we live in a world with an enemy. Mm-hmm. And you brought that out as we went back to Genesis 3 on Sunday and highlighted that the fall in Genesis 3 doesn't come solely from Adam and Eve's willy-nilly decision to, well, you know what, that tree really does look good, right? It comes through a internal willingness to misremember or misrepresent God, but then the action and interaction of the enemy in our life who desperately and definitely wants to misrepresent God. But then there's also, as human beings who are fallen and live in a fallen world, we've been hurt by the world and the people around us. Mm-hmm. And so there is a story that our story has told us about the things that are true. There's a story that your story has told you about the things that are true about you, about God, about people, about the world around you. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to talk about both of those things, the things that come through deception and the things that come through, for lack of a better word, are wounding, the things that happen to us. But as we park on the deception part first, and so I'm flipping this in our notes because I feel like I want to start here, that we had mentioned earlier the necessity of avoiding the extremes. Mm-hmm. And you had talked on Sunday that the influence of humanism that has come into our culture, and as soon as you said that, my history brain got triggered, and I started going back to all the lessons that I taught on humanism. And I think it's a great example of things that swing too far, but in their origin were actually good. Because when I hear the word humanism, I go back to the Italian Renaissance in the 1300s, coming out of 600 years of, if you remember any of your history, of medieval Europe, the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, the bubonic plague, all of that. And you came out of a culture where people had been told for 600 years, you don't matter. You don't matter. You are a cog in the medieval wheel. You have a king, you have a lord, and you have a church, and they are who matter and they are what matter, and you don't. Your life is expendable. And your life is meant only to live in service to either the political structure or the religious structure around you. You have no value. And the thing that caused the explosion of Western culture as we know it today is the advent of humanism. It was a correction out of the you don't matter thinking to you matter unbelievably. You have incredible worth and dignity and value. Those definitions that you brought out on Sunday, it swung too far. It swung too far, and it lost both the truth of what makes you unique and deserving of dignity, and it lost the power source of what gives you the ability to accomplish anything. That it's not you, it's the one in whose image you are made. And so we swung too far, as is so often the case.
So much. You're on a roll. I don't want to interrupt you. But there's so many parts of that my mind is reacting to and wants to say, but I don't want to fill up all of our time. However, first, just pause for a moment and think about that historical reality. This is the counterculture. I mean, this is what made Jesus stand out when he spoke, because he was bringing dignity. I love talking about the fact that Jesus identified those that were unseen and saw them in so many different ways, from crossing the line from the Jews to the Gentiles to seeing value in women. In so many ways, Jesus elevated and saw the unseen, which was what it would take centuries for the political secular culture to embrace in the rise of humanism. Jesus was clearly way ahead of the curve of his time. And this is what made him stand out so profoundly. So there's that reaction. And then there's, even when I was doing my simple research and trying to say, okay, how do I talk about humanism in really what winds up to be about a minute, 90 seconds to 2 minutes? How do I define this? And coming to a simple definition that identifies those three basic tenets of humanism, and me reading those three tenets and going, yes,
they're right.
Right. I don't have a problem with this. Equality, thinking and using reason and thinking on our own, and then the value of the individual. All of those individually really good. But when I define God through that lens, now I get into trouble. And because what happens is I start with me and define God through me. So God starts to look like me rather than God looks like God. And when we step back and recognize that the God of the universe, the creator of the universe, actually operates with value for every human being, the ability for us to make a choice. That's where that reason and thinking comes from. And then the equality of all of his created humans. And that's how that God works. Now I don't start with me, I start with God.
Yes.
And I start with a God who says, this is what's important, but it's important because of me, not because of you.
Yes.
And when I say me, I'm talking about me, God.
Yeah.
It's important because of God, not because of you, human.
Yeah.
And there's just such a profound shift there that is overwhelming. And so I think about this and look at this and go, here's where this pervasive temptation, this pervasive tendency exists. Most of us are influenced by Western culture, and Western culture is built on these three ideas. I mean, you can take these three ideas and go, oh, they're written into the Constitution, right? I mean, some of them in the Declaration, and we love that, and we're pursuing that, and we should. Because it reflects our Creator, and it reflects our Creator more than it reflects us. And that's where, okay, let's shift this back and get a view of God versus a view of ourselves. And I mean, it's so sneaky what the enemy does. It's just so sneaky.
It is. And so that's the first place where if we're really going to begin to live this out, cultivating that sensitivity to our own selfishness, right? There's no problem with the prayer I'm praying last night for my wife to feel better and not get sick. But to be sensitive to, if this is the bulk of the way that I'm praying is, God, here's a problem, fix it. God, here's a problem, fix it. God, here's a problem I'm anticipating, fix it. God, here's another problem I'm anticipating, fix it. That's not a relational connection with
God's
God.
Your handyman.
God's my handyman, right? And this is the heart of selfishness. It's, God, here's what I want you to do. And you said it yesterday, I'm pretty sure. I'm remembering this. I think you said it. At best, he's our collaborator, and at worst, he's our servant. Right? And that's the heart of the issue with our selfishness, is we've changed the order. We've flipped it to a place that is inappropriate, where he is no longer creator and we are created, that we start either making God in our image or we start looking like God is our employee. And again, there's a way where you can even go back to the scriptures and you could make an incorrect but plausible argument for this, right? Jesus said, I came not to be served, but to serve. And it's like, all right, Jesus, well then I'm pulling up through the drive-thru and here's what I want. I want a number 1. I want 2 number 2s. I want a number 3 with a Diet Coke, and let's go. Chop, chop. Right.
But that's exactly right. And that's exactly what we do. That's it. And we do it innocently. If there's any such thing as innocent selfishness, this is it. I mean, because it feels like we're doing the right thing. It feels so very, very close.
I'm going to the right place with my requests.
And oh God, I'm leaning into who you are. But but we very subtly make that shift and go, I'm leaning into who you are, and I'm going to dictate to you what you do.
Yeah.
And before long, when you spin in that, before long, not only am I dictating what you do, but now I'm redefining what you said.
Yes.
And then we start holding God accountable to some promises he never made.
Exactly. Yeah. And so again, he didn't say, let me take your order.
Yeah.
He said, I'm going to do whatever it takes to give you a better life than you could have on your own.
Right.
I'm going to sacrifice for you because I know what needs to happen in order for you to have a life you could not imagine on your own.
Right.
This is not the medieval traditional monarchy where you don't matter and the king is all that matters.
Right. This is a benevolent king, and we miss this.
We do.
We miss the heart of God, and a part of how we miss it is so it's kind of a vicious circle. Like we've got this, okay, I've got my wants, I've got my desires, and now I'm leaning into who I understand God to be, and there's a bunch of accuracy there.
Yes.
Like a whole lot, like 99%, 98% accuracy.
Yeah.
And I'm leaning into that, and it feels right. And then before too long, now I'm starting to redefine God, and now the benevolent God is not the benevolent God. He's the selfish God, because it's not him, it's me.
Right.
I'm God.
Right.
Like, you work for me.
Yeah.
There's this old, I remember it out of this little track that Campus Crusade used for years to talk about this coming into a relationship with God. And you would go through the process of, they called it the 4 laws. You go through the process of what it looks like to be far from God and draw close to God. And then the very last one talked about the lordship of God. And it was a circle that in the center of the circle, there was a throne, a chair. And the question was, who sits on that throne? Mm-hmm. And so often we have the circle, the chair is in the circle, and it's me on the throne and God somewhere around that, rather than God on the throne and me, on the outside looking in. And that's what the little track was advocating, is put God on the throne. Order your life around him being God, not you being God. And it's so easy for us to start with, I'm overworking the promises, I'm demanding the promises, and then it's just a little tiny half step into, I'm sitting on the throne, God's working for me, I'm the God, and now I no longer have the benevolent God. Mm-hmm. Because I have the me God. And I'm just going to tell you, I'm not benevolent.
Yeah. Because
I'm selfish. Because everything goes through my desires, my want, my pleasures.
Yeah, I was, again, last week as I was prepping for this, I had this moment with God where, again, this has been the theme of the last few weeks, is you start to teach something and then God starts to teach you about how it applies to your life. And so I was just, he was sort of bringing these realities to mind, that this isn't Jesus at the drive-through window saying, let me take your order. Yeah. This is the King of the universe saying, I have come to serve, and I'm the King of the universe. Yeah. And
I'm not abdicating my throne.
Right.
I'm serving from my throne.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there was this conversation that God and I started to have where he was bringing some things to mind for me. And so I said, Jesus, I want to fully surrender to you as Lord. That really is the desire of my heart. And that's not a one-time decision. That has to be an everyday decision. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But I asked him the question, right? Because it's not enough to say, Jesus, I want to fully surrender. What's for lunch, right? There has to be a level of intentionality, of investigation, of show me.
Right.
And so I asked him the question, where am I withholding my surrender? Let's make this practical in my life, God. I'm giving you permission. I'm willing to acknowledge I'm probably blind to a bunch of this. Right. Will you show me? Where am I withholding my surrender? And the response that came up was in my pursuit of comfort and in my use of time, which if you caught the episode previously, I talked a little bit about that, standing outside as I'm looking at my animals and God's bringing to mind, hey, would you go pray for this person? Sure. Would you pray for them for the next hour? You jerk, right? How dare you? I have plans. But the words that started to come to mind were the Lord saying to me, John, I am not selfish, John, I'm not selfish, meaning he's not unconcerned with my wants and desires, like you were talking about earlier.
Right.
I want to bring the best of them to fulfillment, and I want to save you from the destruction of the worst of them. I do not desire to be a tyrant over your life, but I do want to guide you, the good shepherd. And it was really interesting that as I went to type that in my notes, autocorrect kicked in and turned it into God shepherd. And I had this other moment, again, the history brain kicked on.
Yeah.
And that is yet another one of the things that distinguishes Jesus from any other religious belief system, is it is the one and only God who comes to serve. The one and only God who comes to shepherd, to not just rule and reign from on high as dictator who occasionally doles out some blessings and rewards if you happen to be faithful and don't tick him off or they're smiting. But the good shepherd, the God shepherd, says, follow me.
Right.
And then I got some more imagery because we got some animals out on our hobby farm, and I know what it's like to be out with my animals and have this exact scenario play out. And it looks like this. The good shepherd says, follow me. And the sheep says, well, I want to eat. So no, I'm going over here. But the good shepherd says, I want you to eat too. Over here is the best place to eat. Right. Come over where I am. This is actually for your good.
Right.
But my animals and us as people are like, no, I'm pretty sure I know better. Let me go over here and get myself stuck.
Yep.
All right. The sheep say, I want to feel safe. So I'm going to go over here and wedge myself into this little spot so I feel safe. The good shepherd says, I want you to feel safe too. Over here is the best place to be safe.
Right.
Come over here.
Right.
The sheep say, I want to enjoy my life, right? My animals go off and frolic willy-nilly all over the place. And it's like, seriously, I got to go bring you back because that's actually not good over there. I know what's over there and it's not good.
Right.
The good shepherd says, I want you to enjoy your life too. Over here is the place of optimal enjoyment. And you start looking at the things that were either said about Jesus or that Jesus said, that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, right? It's not pain and suffering if we choose to follow Jesus, and that's all that Jesus offers. Right. It's for the joy set before him and for the joy set before us. It's Jesus' promise in Matthew that my yoke is easy and my burden is light. There is work. This isn't a carefree life where we all run around and do whatever. Right. But it's not as hard as, again, we come back to this is the deception at work.
Right.
It's not as bad as the enemy wants you to believe.
Right.
And even in Colossians, there's this verse that pops out in the first chapter. May you be filled with joy.
Yeah.
May you be filled with joy.
Yeah. One of the things that I've thought about as it relates to this whole idea of meology and living in that is often what happens is when I'm sitting on the throne, my desires, my wants, my pleasures, they drive my decisions, and I avoid the path of pain.
Yep.
And the path of pain often is the path to that joy.
It is.
And we bypass that.
Yeah.
I will shortcut the things that are good for me to get to the things that I want.
Yeah.
And God is always going to lead us to the best outcome. But that path to the best outcome often dismisses and bypasses my pleasures and my comforts.
Yeah.
And we rewrite a God in that is all about when I'm on the throne, we rewrite a God, we reform him in my image, that will actually only exist to satisfy my cravings. Yeah. And it's a very difficult place for us if we're serving the God on the throne that is us.
Exactly.
And it's a very joyless place.
It is.
It ultimately is. And I know in the middle of the pain, in the middle of the challenge, in the middle of the difficulty, in the middle of the desert, it doesn't feel true.
No.
Like it's like, oh yeah, I hear you, Lee, but you don't know. You don't know how bad this is, or you don't know how lonely I am, or you don't know whatever that difficult place is. But I do know, one, because I've had my own journeys in that place. But I know not because of my own, I know because I know the shepherd. Yeah. I know how good the shepherd is, and I know the nature of the shepherd. And somewhere in our life, if we're going to get this right, we have to get a better picture of the shepherd. Yeah. We have to get that picture right, because otherwise we're going to be in that hard place. Yep. And we're going to go, the shepherd's not good. All of this, I mean, It's what I love about Genesis. And it's kind of funny. I think people go, oh, Old Testament, boring, uninteresting. But particularly for me, Genesis and the first 3 chapters of Genesis, man, when you get that clear and you get that right, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that just falls into focus and starts to make sense. And when you start to look at the narrative between God and Adam and Eve, you start to look at the narrative between God and His created man and woman. Yeah. And you really pay attention to it. You start to understand some stuff. You start to understand why we do what we do, and you start to understand God in a very different light. And so I love that part. I mean, every time I read it, every time I teach it, I get gripped by. There's that question in the middle where Adam and Eve have fallen prey to the serpent's redefinition of God, and the serpent has injected doubt into their relationship, has led them to modify God and then act as if they are God. And it follows up with God being Yahweh God. Being the relational God. He comes and he's looking for that time with his created human beings, this time that has been rich and meaningful and sweet, the time that God created them for. It's described in the text as to walk with him in the cool of the day. And he comes and he goes, where are you? And the shift that happens is, oh, here comes the judge. Right. I mean, and Adam and Eve are, I hid from you. I was ashamed. I knew what I did was wrong. And God's like, I'm just asking you where you are. Right. Because we hang out. Right. This is what we do. Yeah. And I'm asking you where you are. And that question of where are you is not a question of accusation. It's a question of grace. And I'm struck by that every single time I read it, that where are you question is God saying, it's that picture that you just painted of your animals. It's God going, don't eat that. Right. Eat this. Right. I know you think you want this, but man, this is going to be so much better. Yeah. It's God doing incredibly gracious things in us. And yes, he's got to get them out of the bad stuff, and he's got to correct that, because he's come that we might have life and have it abundant. Yeah. I mean, that shift is huge.
It is. And so that's a place of investigation, right? To sit with God and ask him to reveal to you where the deceptions of the enemy have crept in, where some version of, did God really say, or is God really like, have crept in, because we all have it. We all have it. Yeah. And part of where those deceptions have come in, just like with Adam and Eve, is they happened in context. They happened in situations. They happened through narrative. And so we also have to be willing to invite God to help us reinterpret the narrative, the story that we have lived. Because for some of us, this isn't just a question of theology. This isn't just a question of clean-cut reason and logic and understanding, and I think this, well, I think this. The reason why so much of what we think feels true is because it's what we've lived, not just what we've been taught. And so for some of us, it feels like, well, Jesus is going to, like, I have to take care of myself. I have to be selfish. You don't understand, because if I surrender to Jesus, he's going to ignore my desires unless I speak up for myself, right? And I can even quote you the verse, you don't have because you don't ask, right? So that means I have to be selfish because he's not, because that's what my story has taught me, because the people that were supposed to take care of me in my life, unless I spoke up, it was like I was forgotten. For some of us, it's Jesus' plan for my life is so others-focused that no one is going to take care of me. Right? Jesus said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve, and you're supposed to go and do likewise. You're just supposed to give and give and give and give and give and give and give. And then when you're really tired, you're supposed to be like Jesus and give some more. And then when you're sick and you're grieving, you're supposed to be like Jesus and give some more. So what other recourse do I have than to be selfish?
Me if I don't represent me?
Right? I have to get a little life on the side somewhere, because the life that Jesus offers is apparently so others-focused. What he wants to do through me, that I've got no other option. And for some people, it feels like, if I fully surrender, I know that Jesus is a fan of the bait and switch. that he's going to promise a life to the full that I'm going to love, but then what he's really going to do is send me halfway around the world to some far-flung place where nobody speaks the language and I can't get good food. And I'm going to get sent to serve there to be either a missionary or a martyr. Yeah. So thanks, but no thanks. And none of these are conjecture, by the way, because all of these things are either things that I have thought or things that I personally know people have thought about why I'm not willing to surrender either my whole life to God or this part of my life to God. Jesus, I'll give you my praise. I will give you some of my money. I will give you some of my time, but don't you dare touch this. Yeah. Right? It comes back to my thing last week. John, will you pray for them? Of course, God. Happy to. Will you pray for them for the next hour? Don't you dare touch my evening. Yeah. That's mine.
Yeah, I think that I've heard all those arguments too, and I've heard all those. Let me use them like this: protestations. Is that a word? And I've made them. I've heard them because I've said them with my own mouth. Yep. You know, and I think that I think there's on one hand there's part of me that goes, yeah, he may send you to the furthest corners of the earth, sure. And he may ask of you all that you have. Yeah. He may say, I want 100% of your money. Yeah. You know, he may say that. He may say, you know, there are those who are going to say yes to Jesus and they will lose their life. Yeah. They will. Yeah. So on one hand, I need to say that.
It's real.
But I will say this on the other hand. For those that have, ask them if they regret it. I mean, they don't. Yeah. Because if he asks that of you, he has something in it for you. Yeah. And so my other side of it is God is not going to ask of you something that you're not capable of thriving in. Yeah. That's a really important understanding. Yeah.
Not just doing, but thriving in.
That you're not capable of thriving in. And so whether it's how you sacrifice or how you follow. I mean, sometimes following God is not a sacrifice. We got to be honest about that. Yeah. Sometimes following God. I mean, John, I just got to be honest, and I know this is for the vast majority of people who hear this statement, they can't understand it because they haven't lived my life. I can't believe that God put me in a place where every day I get to do what I do. I just can't believe it. And I know I can go back to the argument that God and I had about whether or not I was willing to do what I do. Yep. And my whole view of, but look, financial sacrifice, time sacrifice, emotional sacrifice. I mean, so one of the curses of doing what I do is that I am confronted regularly with very difficult situations. Yeah. Like I had my physical last week, the annual go talk to my doctor. And I've got good health. All of the things that they test and look at are all good right now. But I've got this little back pain, right? And I know it's because of my age, which we're not going to talk about. It's just that point in time in life. I've got a little back pain. So I was saying to my doctor, I got this little back pain. And I said, here's what I need to tell you. I have this little back pain that I know you're going to tell me it's your age. I understand that. But I live in an industry where I am constantly aware of people who find out the worst case scenarios. So I hear stories of that, and I walk with people through their stories. So in my brain, I go, oh, here's this little back pain. Maybe it's one of those stories, right? But I would not trade that for a minute. I want to be there with those people. I can't, but part of what I do is an emotional investment. Yeah. And I remember the argument. God, if I've got to care at that level, God, if I've got to live in that kind of dynamic, I know the argument, but today I'm here to tell you, I cannot believe I get to get up every day and do what I do. And a part of it is not, and I want to be really careful. Every time I talk about my own journey, I feel like, oh man, I don't want people to think I'm saying I've got this figured out. Listen, every single day I go through the battle with who's on the throne. Yep. Every single day. And I wish that it would end, but it won't end for any of us until we are in eternity with God. And we're no longer subject to the temptations that are a part of our current circumstance. So I want to be really careful that I'm not telling stories that make it sound like I've got this figured out. What I want to say is I have done what David suggested, taste and see. I have tasted, and every time I have said, God, you are creator and I am not, and I am the creature, and I'm going to give everything to you.
Yeah.
Every time I've gone through that process, the other side of that dilemma of sacrifice has been far more rewarding than anything I could have anticipated.
Yeah.
I didn't know. It's kind of like the first time you tasted some good food. I remember the first time I had sushi. Like the idea of raw fish was a dumb idea to me. I was like, look, food's supposed to be battered and deep fried.
Sure.
I grew up in the South, right? And everything's better fried, and so the idea of raw fish was bad. But the first time I had sushi, I went, why didn't somebody tell me about this? And all my friends were like, we've been telling you about this, and some of you hate sushi and all that. So it's a flawed illustration. But what I'm trying to illustrate is every time I've gone through the dilemma, no, God, you can't have it. No, God, you can't have it. No, God, you can't have it. This is a step too far, God.
Yeah.
And I have let go. I have found on the other side something that I could have never dreamed that I enjoyed.
Yeah.
I never could have dreamed that this would be the nature of what the outcome looks like. And I think just, I'm maybe getting ahead of us here a little bit, but I think that I have wrestled with so what's the 1, 2, 3 process by which I avoid self on the throne. And the truth of the matter is my life reminds me that there's not a 1, 2, 3 process. Yeah. And I was, years ago, I heard this story about how people who are in the enforcement business trying to prevent counterfeit currency. Do you know how they figure out? They just constantly look at the real thing.
Right.
Like they go, oh, this is what the real thing looks like. It's not systematically going through and identifying the various elements.
Because the forgeries keep changing.
Exactly. It's just constantly looking at the real thing. And I'm taken back to that. I mean, that's David throughout the course of the Psalm, or not just David, but all the Psalms in the course of the Psalms take us back to, you got to look at the real thing. You got to look at the real thing. You got to look at the real thing. And when I go back to Genesis chapter 3, there's this little nuance in the middle of it. I didn't talk about it Sunday, but I think it's a glaring, obvious kind of thing. So Adam and Eve go through this process. The serpent comes and says, doubt God. And so they bite, and they ultimately doubt God. And then they start modifying God, adding to and subtracting from them. And then once they start doing that, they're now on the throne because they're defining God.
They have to be.
And so then they act as God. And then what happens is they act as God, and something inside them goes, ooh, this isn't right. Yeah. Now we know for them, original sin, original fall, the knowledge of good and evil, that light gets turned on. God was trying to keep that light turned off. Yeah. Not because he was withholding something great, because he knew what you're going to be confronted with is your limits. Yeah. When you know the knowledge of good and evil, now you're going to also know what you're not. And that's an unbearable burden. And God tried to keep us out of that. But now they know. Now they know they're broken. They know they're flawed. They know their limitations. They know they're not God. And now they're ashamed and they're embarrassed. And here's what happens. They no longer have God in their life. They can't see God anymore. And God comes going, where are you? Where are you? Where are you? And Adam goes, I did this thing. I became aware I was naked. I was ashamed, so I hid. What happens when we hide? We don't look at God. Right. Like God's not visible to Adam anymore. I think that's what happens to us, and we have to constantly keep going back to, oh, wait a minute. I got to clear my way through these bushes that I'm hiding in so that I can see God again. Yeah. I need to look at the real thing. I need to spend my time filling my mind and filling my sight and filling my heart with a clear image of the real thing. Yeah. The remedy for selfishness is a clear perspective of God.
It is.
I got way ahead of us.
No. That's perfect. That's exactly where we land is, if you want the closest thing to a 1, 2, 3, it's that. Yeah. It's, you have to spend time with the authentic article. Yeah. But here are some of the challenges, right? If we don't recognize our deception, right, we are unable of undeceiving ourselves, right, if I can say it that way. And so
therefore is our limit.
Right. There's your limit,
yeah,
right?
Your limit.
You can't fix, right? And that's why Jesus has to come, is we couldn't fix the problem that we had created.
Yep.
So if you're comfortable with God and just don't recognize where you're deceived, there's your step one, is invite him to come close and ask you the question, where are you?
Yeah.
Do you recognize where you are? Do you recognize where you're hiding from me? But for some of us, that's really challenging because we're not comfortable with God coming close.
Right.
God is terrifying. Here comes the judge.
Right.
I hear him coming.
Right.
I don't just hide. I run further away so he can't catch me. And so if I were to ask, here comes the judge, to tell me where I'm blind or where I'm not surrendering, that just seems to reinforce the idea that I already have of who this guy is.
Right.
And so maybe that's not the place to start. Maybe the place to start is, God, show me who you really are.
Yeah.
Help me see you as you are, and then we'll get to the places where I'm deceived. Then we'll get to the places in my story, and that may actually be where you and God need to go, is show me the places in my story where I've come to believe that this is who you are.
Well, and one of the things that I think both of us, as we've told our own particular parts of the story, illustrating our own journey and points at which this has become clear to us, one of the things that I think is obvious about this, and I think this is a little bit of the flaw in our thinking. We go immediately to, if I say yes and surrender to God, he's going to send me to the obscure parts of the world, or he's going to make me so others focus I don't have time for, or he's going to choose to take away everything in my life that I like, and so I can't, I won't be able to watch football, and I won't be able to drive a nice car or whatever. Yeah. And what I think our stories illustrate, and I think if you go back and you look at the story of, of history, story of the patriarchs, story of the apostles, story of those who throughout the course of history have followed Jesus, is God rarely comes and says, I'm taking everything.
Right.
It's a piece by piece. So it starts with, hey, John, will you pray with that guy?
Yeah.
And can I have an hour?
Yeah.
Not can I have everything? I just want an hour.
Yeah.
And God actually asks for surrender in bite-sized chunks.
He does.
And so that terrifying, he's going to come and just rob me blind, let's put that away. Yeah. That's a lie from the enemy. There's zero pattern of that in the way God interacts with us, because again, God knows what you're capable of and where you will thrive.
Yep.
And so God will say to you, maybe very simply, can I have 10 minutes to begin every day where you just look at me?
Right.
That may be the biggest surrender he asks for initially.
And that's a great example of how do I start this if I'm not sure, is take a look at your life and see if you've been the one to dictate terms to God, even in just how you spend your time.
Right.
God, I'll give you this time and I'll spend it this way, and I'm going to ask you to bless it.
Right.
Rather than, and this was one of the most disruptive questions early in my life of learning to follow God like this, was I was trying to do it my way and it wasn't getting the results I wanted. I didn't feel like I was getting closer to God. And so I finally said, how do you want to do this? Because this isn't working.
Yeah.
And he told me, and I've alluded to this a few times over the 116 episodes we've done this, so maybe I'll just come out and say it. I was teaching full time at that point at the high school.
Yeah.
I was like, God, I wake up at 5:30 and I don't get home until 5:30 or 6, and I still got hours worth of grading, and I want to have a little bit of fun to watch football or whatever. There's no time.
Right.
There is no time. And I said, so what do you want to do? Because I know you want me to be close. I know my heart's desire is to be close. What do we do? And I still remember to this day, the words came so clearly to mind. He said, you're not real busy at 4:30 in the morning, are you?
Yeah.
And my first thought was, you jerk. You're noticing a theme. But my second thought was, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
That is open time in my schedule.
Yeah.
And so I committed to waking up at 4:30 to go spend time with God. And the first morning, I was super groggy. I'm not a caffeine person. I'm not a coffee person in the morning, but that day I wished I was. And I went through my day.
John, Coke.
I went.
Get you a Coke.
I'm a Diet Coke person too. But,
well, that's all right.
Right. So I went through my day and I was okay. Right. I spent an hour with God in the morning.
Yeah.
And then started my 5:30 routine as usual. And I was amazed at the difference in the day. But then I got home and I watched Monday Night Football because it happened to be a Monday. And it's East Coast, so I didn't go to bed till midnight.
Right.
And so then 4:30 comes. And I woke up and I'm like, God, this is impossible.
Right.
And so here was the follow-up. He said, I told you what time to wake up. I didn't tell you what time to go to bed.
Right.
Like, you chose that. You chose you at the end of the day.
Right.
And so I realized there are some things that need to change if I want what I really say I want. But I can tell you, I did that for a year.
Right.
I did it for a year, and the things that I gave up aren't anything compared to what I got.
Right. So I'll back up from that just a little bit, because there's some people that might be watching that are not quite even where you were at that moment when God said, how about 4:30?
Yeah.
It started actually before you give him 4:30. It started with you going, I need God in my life.
I need more.
Like somewhere way back before that, there was I'm going to give you a slice.
Yep.
And just for somebody that's never even had a moment of this, what I would say is, look, God's not going to ask you to surrender anything till you just invite him in.
Yeah.
Right. Till you just say, hey, okay. Like I think I haven't tested this out, so this is a little bit on the fly. But I think that God won't ask you, he won't interrupt your schedule until he has a footprint in your schedule, right? So God will go, hey, I'm standing here. When are you available?
Yeah.
And you go, okay, God, I'll give you 10 minutes here.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
And before you know it, that 10 minutes, becomes valuable enough that you'll go, okay, God, how about 4:30?
Right. Not because he's stealing, but because it's become valuable enough.
Right. And so you had hey, I gave you a little cut, and God took the little cut.
Yeah.
And then God said, hey, you want more?
Yeah.
And you said, yeah, but I don't have any time for it.
Right.
He goes, well, how about 4:30?
Yeah.
And then, because I know you, then God goes, okay, so I got 4:30. How about I just interrupt you whenever it works for me?
Exactly.
And knowing he goes, hey, you want to pray for this guy? How about an hour?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a progression there, and it's a manageable, and by manageable, I don't mean you're in control. It's manageable in that God knows how you can withstand.
It's the good shepherd. This is surrender.
Shepherd. Yeah.
This is what I want, and he knows better than I do how to get what I want.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think you're right on the nose in terms of here's a practical application. Yeah. For every fear that's welling up in a listener or viewer that's going, oh, I can't do 4:30 in the morning. No way. I'm not giving up Monday Night Football, and I'm not getting up at 4:30. Hey, if God doesn't have a footprint in your life, he's not asking you for that. I can say that with certainty. Yeah. He's just asking you for something. So you may be a person who goes, I can't do 4:30 in the morning. I'm not giving up football. But I'll tell you what, God, I got 10 minutes at noon on Wednesday. He will take it.
Yeah. And so we'll leave it here. We'll go back to the wisdom of those that come before. David in the Psalms. Delight yourself in the Lord. Not just heartless obedience, but delight yourself. Find the value, the richness in whatever footprint he's allowed currently, and he will give you the desires of your heart.
Absolutely.
It's a choice daily. It's not a one-time choice for all time, or at least it is in the way that marriage is, right? It's a one-time moment where I say, this is my commitment forever, but now I got to live it out daily. Yeah. And so if you're looking for the 1, 2, 3, what do I do? Well, if you're comfortable with God coming closer, having more of a footprint in your life, ask about the deception. Yeah. If he doesn't feel safe yet because of what your story has told you, take the risk of inviting him to come a little closer to show you who he is rather than who you've come to believe he is. Be willing to surrender some of the simple places. Yeah. God, how do you want to spend the time that I give you in my schedule? Yeah. Right? What are your thoughts about that? And then recognize this is a daily choice. Yeah. This is not just God running like a software program in the background, magically bringing things to resolution, though he sometimes does. Yeah. This is a God who is deeply relational, desires relationship, and offers deeper connection than we've ever realized. Yeah. That's how we take our faith forward. So
and I would just add to that just one little thing. It may be that in my sensitivity to those that have never really given God any footprint, we go back and say, hey, if he can have 10 minutes on Wednesday, give him that, he'll take it. But you might be in a place where you say, okay, I've been giving him 10 minutes on Wednesday. In fact, I've given him 10 minutes on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I want more. So maybe where you are. And I really do, I'm at this place where I want to say, God, you are creator and you're above all.
Yes.
And I want to begin the process of surrendering my life to you, recognizing that you are indeed the good shepherd, and you will only do that in the measures that I can withstand. How do I start that process?
Yes.
And there's that prayer that we prayed at the end of the message. And I brought it with me today because I think it's helpful.
Yeah.
And just by way of making it accessible, I first of all want to be sure that you understand I'm not the author of the prayer. I'm just the editor of it. It's a prayer that is found in A.W. Tozer's book, Pursuit of God, and I rewrote it in some more accessible language. And but it's a prayer that we also have in print. And if you want a printed copy or an email copy, I'm happy to send that out. But maybe just read this. Let me read this over us, and then let you wrap it up. The prayer goes like this. O God, be exalted over my possessions. Nothing of this earth's treasure will be dear to me if only you are glorified in my life. Be exalted over my friendships. I'm determined that you will be above all, even if I must stand deserted and alone in this life. Be exalted above my comforts, even though it may mean the loss of bodily comforts and the carrying of heavy crosses. I will keep my vow I made to you today. Be exalted above my reputation. Make me ambitious to please you, even if as a result I must sink into obscurity and my name be forgotten like a dream. Rise, O Lord, into your proper place of honor, above my ambitions, above my likes and dislikes, above my family, my health, and even life itself. Let me sink so you may rise. Use my life for your service so that others may sing to you the song. Hosanna in the highest. Amen.
So as always, first and foremost, thanks for letting us be on our own journey.
Yeah.
Because we have not arrived.
Absolutely.
But we continue to learn. And thank you for letting us be a part of your journey. And hopefully what we have learned is helpful as you continue to grow deeper in your connection with who God is, who he says you are, and what he's showing you is true about the world around you and the place he's called you to at this time. So thanks for being a part of this. We'll see you all next time.